make a start, I'm really pleased to welcome Ian Tustian, what a name.
I know.
Tustian, who is one of our West Midlands HMIs, who has really kindly agreed to come and talk to us about how the curriculum looks, what makes an effective curriculum. And I think it's work that all of us got really engaged in a couple of years ago, and then with the last year, it is just such a timely reminder of what we should be thinking about. So thank you to Ian, and over to you in terms of talking us through.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for everyone that's out there on the call. It's, as ever, it's quite strange doing this virtually. I'm going to talk probably for about half an hour, and then at the end of that, sort of invite questions. But feel free to put the questions in the chat as we go along, in case you forget what they are as we get towards the end. As Debbie said, I'm one of Her Majesty's inspectors in the West Midlands. I've been with Ofsted for about 18 months now, officially, if you like, but worked as an Ofsted inspector since 2012, but in the southeast. So I've sort of made the switch from regions, which has been quite an interesting jump to make over the last sort of 18 months. When I talked to BEP about what they wanted me to talk about, that idea about effective curriculum and what is an effective curriculum was really at the forefront of this. And before I start, what I want to do is to stress really clearly that Ofsted doesn't have a preferred curriculum or approach other than seeing an ambitious and well-structured and well-sequenced curriculum in schools. There is no sort of Ofsted formula, which if you have your curriculum looking like X, Y, or Z, then we'll come along and tick those boxes and send you on your way. It is about context. It is about the way it works in your school. But I'm going to come back again and again during the course of the next half hour to that idea of well-structured and well-sequenced curriculum. And I'm going to actually share with you a couple of analogies along the way that I've picked up from various teacher blogs, and also have picked up from some of the research that Ofsted have done around curriculum, to try and really make you think really and prompt you with some questions that you can take back and ask to subject leaders within your school. So if I start at the beginning, really, the first question, and it is a simple question in effect, is that all right? Can everyone hear me all right?
Just going to say a big welcome from everyone to Paige for joining today, because Paige is doing a lot of work and trying.
Oh, can people hear me okay? Can somebody give me a thumbs up?
Yeah, we can hear you, Ian, but can I just remind people, can you make sure you've turned your mute buttons off so that Ian isn't disturbed by the exciting activity going on in your head teacher offices?
Thanks, Debbie. Normally I leave myself on mute, which is my normal trick. So in terms of what's a curriculum, and what we found when Ofsted asked this question way back in the beginnings of the education inspection framework is this was understood in many different ways, both actually between schools and actually within schools as well. Some subject leaders' interpretation of what curriculum is actually different from other subject leaders in school. From that, what Ofsted did, what we did was we set up our own definition, if you like, of what is curriculum. And if you think about the education inspection framework, we're really talking about that section that sits under intent. And intent being everything up until the classroom door. Intent's more than those broad statements. It's more than those broad things that schools put on their website. It's everything in your planning that leads right up until that teacher opens the classroom door and begins to go and deliver the curriculum to the young person and the young people in the class. So the curriculum really is that framework for setting out the aims of a programme of education, including those key knowledge and skills to be gained at each stage. And it's this idea that in constructing that curriculum, we're communicating to young people that deep body of knowledge, and we've got a really clear picture of the endpoints. So the curriculum is really ultimately, it's a conversation, it's a narrative, it's a journey. It's not simply one thing after the other. And over time, it's been crafted by your subject leaders as a whole in that sort of thoughtful and considered way. And in terms of what we actually then mean by curriculum, unpicking that a little further, we can talk about curriculum at a school level, a subject level, or within a sequence of lessons. And curriculum is really the what is taught. It's that specific plan of what pupils need to know and should be able to do. At a whole school level, There's lots of curriculum questions around the offer to pupils. At Key Stage 2, we talk a lot about is the curriculum being narrowed without a proper coverage of foundation subjects? At Key Stage 3, are all pupils gaining their full Key Stage 3 education entitlement? Are there some national curriculum subjects that are not available to pupils at GCSE? And how does the range of vocational and academic subjects at Key Stage 5 meet local need? However, a curriculum is absolutely the sum of its parts, and its parts are organised into subjects. And really the question I put to you is as school leaders, how do you ensure and assure that the curriculum in each subject is well planned? And as you're doing your work with your middle leaders, it's thinking about how you're ensuring they're able to produce that coherent curriculum and how you're quality assuring that process. Ofsted often asked why we need to consider curriculum when actually we have a curriculum already. It's called the national curriculum, and at Key Stage 4 we have exam specifications. But it's really important to point out that those documents only provide those broad topic headings, those desirable high-level outcomes, if you like. For instance, the National Curriculum for History talks that children should learn about the expansion and dissolution of empires. What it does not provide is an outline of the content necessary so that pupils have achieved that high-level outcome. So what the curriculum isn't, it's much more than just the subject or qualification offer. It's not the same as teaching activities. It really is what is being taught, not how it is being taught. And in particular, reference to the last bullet point is absolutely not vague. It is really that specific plan. The devil is absolutely in the detail. And I'm going to pull some examples of that as we go through this in terms of the sorts of questions I might ask from an inspection point of view, and actually that you might ask as leaders' point of view, in terms of making sure that there's sufficient detail in those curriculum plans so you can follow through the threads of learning through each year group. Is the curriculum ensuring that pupils in year 8 are drawing on what they've learned in year 7? Talk to me as a subject leader about how certain key concepts are being developed throughout the key stages, so that in Key Stage 5, pupils are able to draw succinctly on key concepts and knowledge that they've learnt at Key Stage 4. And the education inspection framework is really clear. And as an ex-head of maths, who led maths in a number of schools, that the text in blue is really important. There should be no conflict between teaching that broad, rich curriculum and achieving success in examinations and tests. I was very proud of the maths curriculum that I put together when I was head of maths, because not only did it enable pupils to do well in their examinations, it also, at GCSE, it also enabled them to successfully transition to Key Stage 5. So ultimately they had a good grounding to move on to the next stage of their education. Again, really important at this point, just to distinguish and just to make sure that we're being crystal clear in terms of distinguishing between the what is taught and the how it's taught. And in some schools, there's still a propensity to put that how first. Let's think about how the curriculum is going to be delivered without ensuring that we've got sufficient detail in what is going to be delivered to our young people in their classrooms. And again, more on that to follow as I unpick that a little bit further in the presentation. I'm sure what I'm about to share with you now, lots of you have seen before, but I just want to reinforce it and share again with you Ofsted's definition of progress. So Ofsted's definition of progress is about young people knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more. The quote at the top there summarises the way that learning is understood in cognitive psychology. This is not the only way learning can be defined, but it's useful because the quote summarises the way learning means having new knowledge. And as many of you, as I'm sure you know already, the focus very much is on the knowledge that young people gain over time. And if we think about curriculum as the progression model, i.e. if pupils are learning the curriculum, then they're making progress, we can begin at the end really and be asking, what should our young people know? What should they be able to do by this point in the curriculum? What sort of questions should our young people be able to answer at point X, Y, and Z as they move through the curriculum? And what should our young people take away with us that will ensure they're ready for their next stage And that could be the next topic in the unit. That could be a year down the line. That could actually be 3-4 years down the line. It's that readiness for the next stage that the curriculum is explicitly identifying and communicating through the teaching to the young people in classrooms. So, when sequencing the curriculum, where does order really matter? Where are there certain topics or concepts or pieces of knowledge where actually it's really pivotal and important that they're located where they are in the curriculum plan? Where's there flexibility in other subjects, in other with other key pieces of knowledge? Is there other bits that we can move about, and actually we can think about where we place them around those key concepts and bits of knowledge that really matter? Just want to touch on skills and knowledge, because it's something that comes up quite a lot. So far, I've made no formal distinction between skills and knowledge. We've sort of given that definition, which talks about progress broadly as knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more. But the question, I suppose, really is, do we need to think about skills and knowledge separately? Are skills and knowledge a binary? So we progress in skills and separately progress in knowledge, as outlined in this slide. What I would suggest is that that's actually a false binary. And actually, knowledge leads to skills, which then leads to progress. That original slide is a false binary, because the capacity for that composite cognitive performance, which we might call skills, require knowledge. So really in Ofsted, what we consider skill as the capacity to perform, drawing on what is known. And I'll give you an example of that throughout, as we go throughout the rest of these slides. You'll see that come up again and again, where actually, in order for young people to practice a skill, they need to draw on that secure knowledge to develop. So just thinking about some of the terms that Ofsted use, and again, you may have seen these before, and I'm going to refer to these as we go forward, around composite and components. So in Ofsted, we call the prior building blocks of curriculum content the components, and we call those more complex content or tasks the composite. And you can see an example here from art. For example, learning to paint effectively with colour requires some component learning to have taken place, which feed in to that composite task. And again, as a maths teacher, I'll give you an example in a minute of various composite tasks which require huge amounts of component knowledge. And should those components not be there, then performance in that composite task is going to be very difficult for that young person to achieve. So again, going back to curriculum design, are those components being accurately identified, and are they feeding into that pupils being able to complete those more complex composite tasks? Just as sort of a health warning, I suppose, really, and I'm not going to talk about assessment today, but I'm just going to touch on it briefly at this point, because research has shown repeatedly that the sorts of high-level outcomes we see stated in assessment objectives are not what pupils need to practice. It's the analogy of, if I want to get better at running a marathon, I don't do that by running lots of marathons. What I'm saying is that repeatedly practicing the composite is unlikely to lead to an increase in the capacity to perform well. For instance, if I want to improve my evaluative writing, it doesn't necessarily improve if I just do lots more evaluative writing. It needs me to unpick those component knowledge that I need to develop in order to get better at that composite task. To solve those complex multi-stage mathematical problems, I need to have the security in that component mathematical knowledge to draw upon in order to complete those tasks. That's why, when we learn an instrument, we might practice sight reading and scales, not just that final performance. The idea is that we're practicing those composite tasks in order to, those component tasks and component knowledge in order to perform the composite. And that's where sometimes assessment and trying to use summative assessment formatively can actually be a little bit dangerous. I can think again from maths of the use of question level analysis of GCSE papers, and there's always got to be a health warning with that, because if I'm looking at my question level analysis and I'm seeing that pupils repeatedly can't expand a pair of linear brackets, it actually might not be the expanding of the bracket is the issue. It might be one of those component pieces of knowledge that is getting in the way. Those pupils might, for instance, struggle with negative numbers, or they might struggle with indices, or they might struggle with collecting like terms. And it's that component knowledge which is preventing them from doing that composite task. So when we as Ofsted talk about the importance of knowledge, sometimes one of the criticisms that get levelled is about rote learning. When we talk about that importance of knowledge, we're not advocating rote learning of isolated chunks of information, like bits of knowledge placed in a bucket. It's not possible, even if it was desirable. For instance, I can give an example about asking a pupil about the 3 types of blood vessels and was told about veins, arteries, and caterpillars. Really, what our minds don't work like that. That bucket analogy is a poor one to illustrate how we hold that knowledge in our minds. Humans can only learn new knowledge by making connections between new knowledge and what has already been learnt. So the web is a much better analogy for how people hold knowledge in their minds. It shows knowledge as that interconnected web or schema. For example, every time a pupil encounters a new contextual use of the word empire or energy or metaphor, it adds to the complexity of their understanding of that concept. It gives them a deeper understanding of that concept and capacity to use that concept in their own thinking. So what a strong curriculum does, it anticipates the sequence knowledge children need to gain rich interconnected webs of the most useful knowledge. And again, an example, a young person who was studying the Mayans in history, when I asked them about what they were doing, they were able to draw on their geographical knowledge of the place, their understanding of chronology, and their actual knowledge of hierarchy and social class, which they'd picked up and developed through previous work that they'd done around Romans and medieval England. And it was really evident in the curriculum planning about how those concepts, how that knowledge of the way social class and hierarchy had evolved in society over time was being developed, and that young person was linking what they were doing to now to what they'd done before. In some subjects like maths, we want pupils to pretty much remember everything they learn. However, in some subjects, it's not expected that every single detail mentioned in lessons will be remembered. That extra content is provided to give meaning to that crucial detail. However, teachers need to be aware of what that crucial content is. What is it they definitely want pupils to remember? Is that explicit within the curriculum? When I often talk to teachers, I'll say, okay, tell me about what you've done today. Tell me about where that lesson fits into the sequence of lessons. And what is it today? What are those key things that you wanted young people to know and remember, which they're going to build on in their future learning? So really, do the teachers understand the nuggets that people should have learned previously and the new nuggets that they're learning that will enable them to succeed in their subsequent learning? As I've already said, those component parts are drawn together differently in different subjects. So that notion of high quality content selection needs to be given that appropriate and considered thought through the curriculum plans. And the top example on there is a real one from a school, one of my own schools, that, where I stood outside a year 8 history lesson with my head of history, who was telling me that the class were working on their evaluative skills. Again, that false binary in effect. Walking in to the classroom, that question was on the board, and my immediate questions to pupils were, well, tell me what cholera is. Where's Tewkesbury? Tell me about the religious beliefs at the time and their impact on medicine. Do you know how people lived in 1832 in Tewkesbury? Talk to me about social class, about wealth, and how that would have affected how people live. So what was happening there is, without those key concepts of knowledge, the pupils were unable to do that composite task. And again, it all links back to the curriculum. It all links back to those curriculum plans. The second question, that expand and simplify, can pupils draw on their knowledge of indices, addition, multiplication of negative numbers, brackets, their ability to collect like terms, and where have they learned that? And does the teacher know where they've learned that and how they're drawing that into that lesson? I'll talk a little more about retrieval in a minute. I want to note here as well that I see a lot of generic teaching strategies such as questioning, but those actually still rely on pupils having some knowledge to draw on. For instance, I saw one lesson where pupils were asked to describe the advantages of nuclear power. Brilliant questions, amazingly well thought out questions, but because the young people's knowledge of nuclear power was so limited, they were never going to be able to answer in detail. And though the pupils' responses were likely to be superficial and lack depth. I mean, if you ask me about Manchester City, I can draw on a much more complex schema than if you were to ask me questions about Italian opera. And that also applies to terms like challenge. Challenge sits at the heart of an ambitious and well-considered curriculum, not necessarily as an element within lessons. Challenge is reliant on pupils accessing and the schema that allow them to link their learning to consider those increasingly complex questions that are working towards those wider challenging curriculum goals. So we've gone really beyond considering the challenge in the lesson as a discrete thing, rather considering how the lesson fits into a series of lessons that builds pupils' learning as they work towards those challenging curriculum goals. Even more pertinent at Key Stage 5, and I know there was supposed to be a couple of maths teachers on the call. There's a question from, this is a random question, a mechanics question I picked from year 12. And it's even more pertinent, this issue, in year 12, because year 12 often return to us, often wearing smart suits, having grown another 2 inches since we waved them on their way at the end of Key Stage 4. And suddenly we expect them to think, and there's a danger that we expect them to think and behave like experts. And here, that what I refer to as the curse of knowledge as a teacher can strike hard. And that's that cognitive bias that causes people to fail to properly understand the perspective of those who don't have as much information as them. And it can stop sometimes. It can lead to that frustration as a teacher when actually, why don't they understand? And I suppose the point I'm making here with this question is that post-16 provision often draws far more heavily on a far wider range of component knowledge than students may have been historically used to. In order to get pupils to get better at answering questions like that, once upon a time, I would have just given them more questions like that. I would have just repeatedly given them questions with blocks sliding down slopes to do with frictions in the hope that they would get better. And what I really needed to do was spend time making sure that they could remember how to do trigonometry, how to form equations, how to solve simultaneous equations, how to substitute into equations, and understanding key mathematical terms like normal, reaction, and perpendicular. And also, did they remember what Newton's laws were in the first place? So it illustrates that point again, that before I hit those composite tasks, I need to be clear in my curriculum planning that pupils are aware of that component knowledge. As I've said, the danger, therefore, is that curriculum planning can treat pupils as experts when they're still relative novices. And I just want to unpick that a little bit. And there's lots of reading that you can do around cognitive science, around the difference between a novice and an expert. And really, when I'm talking about novices and experts, an expert is able to transfer their knowledge more readily, draw on what they already know, step back and reflect on similar problems that they've seen before, whereas a novice is more likely to dive straight in, can't connect their new learning with their prior learning, and will focus very much on that surface structure of the problem without seeing the deeper connections. Again, for instance, in maths, a picture of a triangle can make pupils think about area of triangle, when actually the question could be about Pythagoras, it could be about perimeter, it could be about angles, it could be about SOHCAHTOA, and the expert is able to make those, use their links from their schema, whereas the novice might just dive in and think about it in very raw terms as a triangle. So our novices have that, what I'm going to refer to and what Willingham refers to as that shallow, inflexible knowledge. That is, students have some understanding of the material, but their understanding is quite limited. It's relatively meaningful, but it's narrow. And there's lots of examples of where you can see that in classrooms as students begin their learning journey and begin to acquire that shallow knowledge as a means to developing that deeper, powerful, better connected knowledge. So it really begs the question, why don't we devise curriculum plans that encourage pupils to think about content in deeper, more abstract terms and just ignore that shallow knowledge? But actually, acquiring that shallow knowledge is required as part of the journey to expertise. And again, when I talk in a little bit more and share the sort of key analogy with you, you'll see that hopefully in action. So I suppose the word coherently planned comes up in the both the good and the outstanding Ofsted criteria. And really, I want to think about, okay, what is a coherently planned and sequenced curriculum? Well, going back to what I've just said, a coherent curriculum is carefully sequenced journey through content on which pupils travel as they move from being novice learners to expert learners, developing that schema and those links between areas of their subject. It's one where pupils have time to reflect and draw on what they've previously learned, to form that schema that will enable them to know more, remember more, and ultimately do more. And one that will enable them to work towards those ambitious endpoints and give them a firm foundation on which to build on in future years. And I'm going to introduce you to a simple analogy now, which there's a gentleman called Neil Almond who's put this on one of his blogs in terms of thinking about that coherent curriculum. And it's the idea is about thinking curriculum as a box set. And some of you may have seen this before. So if you think about a box set, if you think about something like Line of Duty, it has an overarching plot to the whole series. There's a purpose and a clear thread that binds the seasons together. Within each season, there are various subplots, and that links all the episodes of the season together. And within each episode, there's a plot that's resolved, which means actually each episode has its own purpose. There's a reason why it's there. And each of those episodes deepens the understanding until the plot of the season is resolved. What it means is we can't simply watch and understand any single episode because what we do is we lack the knowledge from the previous episodes in order to be able to understand that episode in context. And the plot within each episode is a vital part of understanding the plot for the season, which in turn is crucial to understanding that overarching plot for the whole series. What we often get in Line of Duty or Game of Thrones or similar television programs is we get that quick initial summary at the start, what they call in the TV trade as the previously. And it gives that bare minimum of understanding, but just recaps those key events from either the episode before or maybe even from episodes from much further on in that series or much further on in that season. What happens in summary is that viewers that watch the whole series will start to build that deeper understanding. So in terms of school curriculum, if we imagine Line of Duty as a subject, and we imagine each season being the start of a new year, the subplot is what leaders want pupils to know and remember by a particular point, and each of the lessons are episodes. Each episode helps pupils join the dots as they develop their expertise. And with the previously exercise, as the retrieval thing at the start of the lesson, it helps the exercise that helps bring to mind the key knowledge that's going to be drawn upon in that particular episode. So in each year, teachers should be identifying that core knowledge required in each year group in order to successfully progress and understand what will come next. In other words, the curriculum takes those new ideas and gradually increases the complexity so that children's knowledge goes from shallower to deeper over time. The higher up the school you teach, the more important it is that you understand the detail of what's been taught in those previous episodes. And the lower down the school you are, if you're teaching your year 7, it's really important that as a teacher you understand what's going to happen in the future. What are those key bits of knowledge from this episode that pupils are really going to need to draw on when they get further on in the school as they start to deepen their knowledge. So curriculum plans that pay close attention to consider what pupils will be thinking about or with, not simply or what they're doing. It's that why this, why now. Therefore, that successfully implemented curriculum plan will be manifesting how hard pupils are thinking. That's where the magic happens. That's when they begin to really develop those schema. And again, you can follow that through in various threads. If I'm thinking about history, I might be thinking about a concept in history like invasion. And when I talk to my subject lead for history, I might be asking about how that concept of invasion is developed by pupils as they move through the curriculum, or government, or monarchy, how is that abstract knowledge around what that is being developed as they move through the different units? It might be about how are pupils developing their knowledge of rhetoric in English? How are they developing their knowledge of algebraic manipulation in maths, or forces in physics, or tonality and their use of colour in art? How are those threads being woven through from year 7 as young people learn? Just thinking on a little bit, I've touched on this already. In response to the new framework and lots of the underpinning research, there's been quite a lot of do now tasks which have crept into curriculum plans. However, what I would suggest is it's not simply the presence of the retrieval tasks in the curriculum that strengthens effectiveness. The key to optimizing those retrieval-based activity is to make sure that pupils are being challenged to bring the information to mind from memory, but also that they're relatively successful in doing so. And that's quite a challenge, really, in terms of judging the pitch, because if that retrieval exercise is too hard, there's little benefit, as pupils are not actually practicing retrieval, although actually guessing can, some evidence that guessing has been shown to be helpful. But if the activity is too easy, again, there's little benefit, as then pupils aren't being challenged to think back and retrieve. So when you look at retrieval tasks in your school that your leaders might be putting together as part of the starts of lessons, are they contributing to those challenging curriculum goals in the context of the rest of the lesson? Is that content for retrieval well chosen? If it's poorly chosen, it can end up focusing on the wrong detail. It can actually interrupt that narrative flow of the learning, or actually get in the way of the shaping of the content that made it memorable in the first place. So well-spaced retrieval isn't in itself curricular thinking. And actually, it can be more than just fact-checking as well. Pupils can actually recall those basic knowledge while completing more complex tasks as part of that retrieval. Going back to that box set analogy, I just want to flag why your curriculum shouldn't really be like The Simpsons. With The Simpsons, the viewer needs to get to know the characters and the relationships between them as a beginning point, but there's certainly no overarching plot, and there's no subplot within each series to attend to or to think about. However many episodes we watch, our understanding and knowledge of The Simpsons doesn't really get any deeper. Bart's relationship with Homer changes little over time. Once we've got a basic knowledge of that, that's actually all we need in order to be able to successfully watch and enjoy episodes of The Simpsons. It doesn't deepen or evolve across episodes. So we don't actually have to watch the episodes in a particular order. We can just pick one and think, right, I'm going to watch that one because I just need that basic knowledge in order to be able to access and enjoying it. So again, thinking about what that looks like in terms of curriculum in schools, that was where you'd see pupils weren't moving on from that shallow to deeper knowledge because each lesson acts as something that stands alone. They just continue to amass and gain more shallow knowledge without drawing on that prior knowledge to develop that schema. And you can use that analogy when considering something like problem solving in maths. If we view problem solving as a generic skill with no context, pupils can struggle to know what information to choose, and that can lead to frustration. The learning's very much in isolation. Whereas conversely, if novice pupils are given the ability to recognize the deep structure of a problem by relating it to other episodes in their box set of learning mathematics, they can then better develop that sustainable strategy and develop further their conceptual understanding. And I suppose as I get towards the end of this, I just want to point out that curriculum really is that whole school enterprise. Curriculum really is that progression model. Writers of a complex series don't start by writing each episode and see where it takes them. They know where it's heading. They know where those endpoints are and how those are being put together. And teachers in turn need to know about that journey. Where are pupils traveling on? What will they know from the bits of the journey before? And what bits from this part of the journey will they need to take as they go forward? So people should be remembering that knowledge from previous years and using that in order to make sense of what they learn in their coming years as their understanding deepens. However, it's not just about taking that area of study and thinking backwards. It's about, again, considering the sort of bigger picture, if you like, and also considering the detail. And that bigger picture, making sure that the sequencing of those attainment targets is in a clear order, and that order is important, that those key concepts are revisited, but also consideration of the detail, and sometimes that gets overlooked. Again, I could think of references where I've looked at curriculum plans and it talks about pupils knowing about deforestation, or talks about pupils knowing about renewable energy, and doesn't give the detail in any greater detail. So, thinking about that curriculum, what are they going to learn at the end of this unit? How will they know? What's the final outcome? How will it be produced? How will pupils apply their learning going forward? And in maths, that planning is really important. Choosing examples is you could argue is one of the most important part of the planning process. Making the choice of carefully crafted examples in maths can make up for deficiencies and ambiguities in definitions, explanations, and rules. Examples can identify and exemplify the mistakes and misconceptions that could hinder pupils in their journey from novice to expert. And so that choice of poor examples can have a detrimental effect on learning. It can make it more likely in maths that pupils are going to jump to the wrong conclusion. And really in maths, there is that difference between the content that pupils have learned recently and the content that develops further in their minds through practice. And both of those can be planned for. As pupils progress through their maths curriculum, they need those regular opportunities to rehearse and apply the important facts, concepts, methods, and strategies that they've learned. However, when designing sequences of rehearsal, teachers can consider the quality and quantity of practice that pupils need to make that core content firm in their mind. And then carefully design progression and variation in examples and exercises can allow pupils to make those vital connections. And again, you can see that in maths lessons sometimes when pupils have been asked to do an exercise. Why this exercise? Is there any relationship between the questions? How are those questions developing not only pupils' fluency, but also contributing to their wider understanding and their conceptual understanding as well? And it's thinking about why we're asking pupils to do what we're doing in maths and across all subjects. 2 more slides and then I'm done. Just to say really that the absence of that necessary prior knowledge can indicate weaknesses with curriculum planning. Quite simply, do pupils remember their prior learning from last week, last month, last year? If it's not remembered, was the original curriculum intent realistic? Was that key content given sufficient emphasis in that lesson and as part of that sequence of learning? Did the planning in the curriculum planning allow for a realistic possibility that pupils would remember that key content? And what is it that teachers intended that pupils would remember? And how is that reflected in the curriculum plan? Just a final health warning, really, that curriculum design, as we all know, is complex. It takes time to get that meticulous level of detail needed. And that knowing the end goal is vital and provides the clarity and something to work towards. I mean, for instance, it would be impossible to teach a pupil everything about rivers. So teachers in their curriculum planning need to carefully and judiciously select what specifically they want pupils to know and remember, and how this is going to lead to that deep interconnected knowledge. And at that point, that's about 35 minutes. And that sort of really draws me to a close in what I was going to say. Debbie, I can see you've appeared there, and I'm going to just ask really if there's any questions now. I'm going to stop sharing as well.
Ian, can first of all I say thank you for that. And what really struck me actually, I mean, I thought it was really thought-provoking and great analogies and images, but it also really struck me how far we have moved since Ofsted started the real drive towards curriculum being at the heart of the inspection framework. I don't know, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. You know, we are now so able now to cope with the terminology there, with the ideas there, but it was just so refreshing again to come at it from a different angle, hear a different voice on it. And I loved all the maths analogies and the A-level maths problem. I thought that was great, you know, just to keep us on our toes and make sure we're fully understanding everything that's available. We have got about another 15 minutes if anyone's got any questions. And I would ask, if you have got a question, if you pop it on the chat, although there are so few of you, if you do want to, raise yourself, you know, turn on your camera and ask, it would work really well as well. And while you're thinking about your question, I'll just give Ian one to get him started really, which was like I was just talking to him about at the beginning, because I know that many of you after the year that we've now had will be slightly unsure about how well your sequencing has worked, how well that build-up has worked, as during those periods when children were at home, you started to look for the easier things to teach or the things you could teach at distance. And suddenly that sort of really well laid out model has got a bit laid to one side, and now people are working to put it back together. And I just wondered how empathetic Ofsted will be in their visits as they look at schools putting themselves back together after a year of real disruption.
I mean, the handbook's been updated. There's a new version of the handbook that was released at the end of April, and that makes specific reference to the pandemic and its impact on schools. And there's, if you want the paragraphs, it's paragraphs 14 and 15 of the handbook, of the Section 5 handbook. And it clearly says in paragraph 14 that inspectors recognise that most schools will have been unable to implement the curriculum in the usual way during the COVID-19 pandemic. And really, it talks in there in that paragraph about throughout any inspection, inspectors will seek to understand how the school adapted and prioritised the curriculum from September 2020. So there is explicit mention of that within the handbook, and also actually within the grade descriptors as well, under quality of education, that the square brackets which contain the transition statement has been altered and changed, and again makes specific reference to the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic. And it is really an inspection unpicking that really with leaders and actually making sure, from my point of view, that this is going to sound a little blunt, making sure that it is the pandemic that's caused and slowed the implementation of that curriculum and any issues in terms of the curriculum intent, rather than leaders in action, if I suppose that makes sense. But that comes out in the conversation, the discussion.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that is something that people will find reassuring, and will ensure we all go back and look at the new version of the framework, which is actually a little different and does have some useful extra bits in it. Anyone else got any questions they'd like to ask? Pinder has just become visible. Is that for a question?
It is actually, yeah.
Right.
I'm going to ask perhaps a question that you're, I don't mean to put you in a difficult position. Perhaps you can't answer. Oh, somehow I've put my thumb up. I don't know what I was doing there, and now I can't take it down. What am I doing? Oh, there we go. So I won't be upset. Obviously, look, if you can't answer, you can't answer. I'm just trying to say, from your experience, when you've been visiting schools, and quite often Ofsted will obviously, well, most times they'll look at a website in advance, and I've noticed by looking at school websites, people have heard this word intent, and you're seeing sections on school websites pop up all over the place where people are interpreting that as almost like a cue, a signal, as to putting particular information on a website. Have you got any sort of just advice that you can give us as to what you've seen as really good quality practice, or something that's really not great quality practice?
I think that, as I said, the thing to think about with intent is think about intent as being everything up to the classroom door. So go beyond those broad statements. And some schools put lots of information about their curriculum off on the website. If you want to do that, then schools can do that. It's as we have that educationally reflective conversation at the start of the inspection process that we begin to unpick what's on the website. So, you know, if there is a broad intent statement in there, I'd want to get under the skin of that and say, well, what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like in terms of the way that your middle leaders are planning and sequencing their curriculum, to make sure that people, I go back to the definition, all back to that key definition of progress, to make sure that pupils know more, remember more, and are able to do more. When I look at a school's website, because obviously we do that as one of our preparation activities, it'll more often than not, regardless of what's on there, raise questions, and those will come out through that, certainly through that initial call, through the meetings with leaders on day one, and then as we get into the deep dives and those conversations with middle leaders, what's the detail that sits behind any intent? Because, like I say, for me, the danger with intent is we want pupils to have a broad and balanced curriculum, we want X, Y, and Z, when actually intent goes much deeper than that. It's that coherently planned and sequenced curriculum that builds, works towards pupils having that cumulative sufficient knowledge.
Can I interpret it like that? That is clear. So am I understanding this, that you're potentially saying that if you were to find a disconnect between what was posted on a website, let's say it's a magical thing we want all kids to know, and then through that questioning, that actually isn't coming to fruition. Leaders haven't got the middle leaders, specifically classroom practitioners, haven't necessarily, that they're not able to articulate that. Kids aren't able to articulate that. There's clearly a disconnect between the two. I'm assuming then that's when the issue becomes, because your intention might be X, but you're not clearly implementing
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you think about the implementation as being it was when they've actually walked through the classroom door, almost like your pedagogy, I suppose. So your intent is everything up to that classroom door, and then your pedagogy, your implementation is what's happening in the classroom. Is the teaching helping people to remember that long-term content that's set out in that curriculum plan? Are teachers using assessment well to make sure that pupils have learned what's in that curriculum plan? Does that make sense? Are the explanations that teachers are using clear? Are they communicating that knowledge to pupils that's set out in that detailed curriculum plan? So if you imagine that the intent as being what you want pupils to learn, and the implementation as being, that's your pedagogy in some respects, in terms of that classroom practice. Does that make sense? And what you choose to put on your website is entirely up to you, because it will provide that stimulus for the conversation. It will absolutely provide. From my point of view, obviously, if there's more detail on there, it's more helpful, but there doesn't have to be. There has to be what's required in terms of what schools and academies should publish on their website.
But that's interesting. Sorry to speak over you, but yeah. not more helpful in terms of making a judgment. More helpful.
No. In terms of start. Absolutely. Absolutely. If there's some evidence on there of perhaps some of the sequencing decisions that certain subjects have made, it makes me one step further down the conversation, rather than having. Does that make sense? Rather than having to ask at the very outset.
Because for me, we were looking at, we're funnily enough in our school, we're doing a piece of work right now. And one of the things we were talking about was it's striking a balance between a piece of information you want an inspector to be able to pick up and read if they choose so. But more importantly, quite often we want our parents to be able to. We're noticing, actually, we're starting to track through our student leadership voice. Our students are starting to say more and more and more, I'd quite like to know what's coming up, X. So we were thinking about, we need some way, rather than making 6, 7, 8 different documents, just a document which has all the things for all people, but in a language for all the people who might be able to access it. So you wouldn't necessarily have a viewpoint, because sometimes our students like this kind of, that grid format thing where they can sort of see. But again, you're not going to look one way. No. You're going to say, you're furnished with the information and I generate questions from.
Absolutely. Push Ofsted to one side and think about, okay, who's the intended audience for this website? If it's going to help inform our parents and it's going to be useful to our young people in terms of their learning journey, then absolutely that's an appropriate use of that website. And it'll just, like I say, it'll just stimulate those questions and those discussions for that educationally reflective phone call at the start of the inspection process. And then with middle leaders, as we begin to unpick that, because I might sit down with the middle leader and say, okay, here's what I've got off the website. Tell me what sits underneath it. Show me the detail. So in geography, talk to me about how pupils develop their knowledge, their locational knowledge, and their knowledge of where things are in the world. Or talk to me about how young people develop their knowledge of physical processes around erosion, for instance, or plate tectonics, and show me what does that look like in year 8? What does that look like in year 7? And follow those threads through. So I can start to see, is it joined up? Are pupils making those connections? And then you can do that as leaders. Take your curriculum plans, say, I don't know, history, pick invasion, say, talk to me about how pupils develop their understanding of invasion through the work that they're doing, or some of those second order concepts. How are pupils learning about how historians use historical significance or talk about cause and consequence? How are pupils seeing how historians think in order to develop their own skills in that regard? And you can do that in any subject. You can pick that in any way and follow those threads through with your middle leaders. And can they explain their sequencing in that regard?
That is really helpful. Genuinely, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think worth colleagues being aware that the inspectors who will be ultimately in your school and doing that same job won't necessarily be a specialist in those areas. So using the same tools that you could use as you try to explore areas within your school. So it is really, really helpful, detailed answer there. Got a couple of minutes left. Anyone else want to ask anything? Pick a brain while we've got an opportunity to do so. No one? Then I'll say thank you very much, Ian. We will put this on our website so people can access it and see it if they haven't managed to get into it. And again, I apologise to those of you who've had a bit of a roundabout route to get onto it today. That isn't how we would normally hope to run things. But can I say a huge thank you, Ian, for coming along today, and look forward to catching up with some of you at another point. And Ian, I'm sure we'll have you back if you're willing to talk to us some more about these as we get into next term's inspection experiences.
Of course. Thank you, Debbie.
Thanks,
Thank you everybody for your time.
Thank you.
And I hope you have all school leaders have a chance to have a proper break over the summer after what has been an exhausting 18 months. And so all the best.
Heartfelt thoughts there. Yeah, absolutely. We would